Hey, Heartland. Good morning. How are we this morning? Hey, let's say hi to all of you people who are celebrating spring break and all of your warm climates, Dan Jacobson. We are so excited for you, but you are. Let's really celebrate those of you who are watching online. We're glad to have you here with us. We're good to be here this morning. We've got a great morning for us, a great teaching ahead of us. But let's jump right in. I don't know about you. There was a time in my life where I really wanted to be an artist. And then I realized I had zero capacity, zero natural ability to be an artist, right? But never did I want to be an artist more than actually a few months ago when, maybe you saw this, when an Italian artist, a famous Italian artist, duct taped a banana to a piece of drywall and sold it at a Sotheby's auction in New York for, get this, $6.2 million. $6.2 million. In fact, the piece was so popular, so famous, so in demand, that the artist created 3 more exactly like it, which, let's be honest, took him probably about 17 seconds, and sold each of those for $150,000. I mean, I could have done that. You could have done that. In fact, this morning, I was thinking, let's take a little bit of some time here to just create some art. What do you say? So here's what I have. I have my supplies. I have some duct tape. I grabbed, I didn't have any bananas in the staff break room, but I have a granola bar here. And if I just take this and a little bit of duct tape, and the thing about granola bars is they don't go bad. Like a banana, that thing's over after a couple of days. And here we go. Nice. Look at that. Now, how much? Can I get 5 mil? Can I get 5 mil? All right, 4 mil. 4 million? How about $4? Anyone have $4 for this? No. What makes someone spend $6.2 million on a banana stuck to a piece of drywall? It's the belief. It's the confidence in this artist that someone out there thinks it's worth it. That someone out there thinks that is actually beautiful. In fact, you know the phrase, you're probably thinking it, beauty is in the eye of the, say it out loud, beholder. It's what every artist counts on. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. I want you to think about that as we jump into the passage that we're going to be studying this morning from Mark's Gospel, chapter 14. We're going to be starting in verse 3. This is the end of Mark's Gospel. Jesus is on his way into Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover festival. And Mark tells us here, he says that while Jesus was in Bethany, reclining at a table in the home of Simon the leper, a woman came in with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume made of pure nard. She broke the jar and she poured the perfume on Jesus' head. Now, some of those present were saying indignantly to one another, "Why this waste of perfume? It could have been sold for more than a year's wages, an entire salary. And the money could have been given away to the poor." And so they rebuked her harshly. "Well, leave her alone," said Jesus. "Why are you bothering her? For she has done a beautiful thing to me. The poor," there you have it, a beautiful thing. "The poor you will always have with you, and you can help them at any time you want, but you will not always have me. She did what she could. She poured perfume on my body beforehand to prepare me for burial. And truly I tell you, wherever the gospel is preached throughout the world, what this woman has done will also be told in memory of her." So here we have this scene. It happens in Simon the leper's house. We should probably call him Simon the leper no more because he's hanging out with Jesus. Jesus had a way of healing people of their sicknesses, and lepers wouldn't actually have hosted a large gathering of people. And it's a strange scene, right? Jesus is in Bethany. That's important because it's the end of Jesus' life as he's going into Jerusalem. It's just a few days. If we flip forward just one page in Scripture, we'll see that Jesus is just a few days away from getting arrested and going to the cross to die for you and me. But now he's at this friend's house. And in the midst of this dinner where Jesus is reclining, the dinner table in first century Palestine would have been close to the floor. Jesus is probably reclining up against the table. And in the midst of this dinner, this woman, Mark tells us, comes into the room. And she begins to pour this alabaster jar's contents of perfume over Jesus. This is strange, right? Is that strange? Does anyone else find this strange? This is strange. Yeah, this is strange. But this actually wouldn't have been all that strange in first century Palestine. See, often people back then in the first century, remember, you're walking around in the hot desert all day. So you and your stinky feet, whenever you go over to your friend's house, are going into their house with you. And so it would have been customary, it would have been hospitable for the host to offer you a little bit of perfume or oil to cover up your stench. I had this thought this week as I was picking up my middle school son and his friends from basketball practice. I was like, you know what? I should welcome you into my car by spraying you with half a can of Body Axe. That's kind of what's happening back here. But this woman actually goes beyond what's customary. She doesn't just offer Jesus maybe a few drops or a couple sprays of perfume. It tells us that she actually goes beyond that and starts dousing Jesus with the entire jar. And that's where this becomes really strange, even for people back then. Now, imagine yourself in the room. Imagine the whole house that has now been taken over by this powerful odor. And there's this tense moment where you and everyone else around you is thinking, what in the world is going on right now? What is this woman thinking? And then some people, we can presume the disciples, they were there with Jesus, and they had a habit of speaking up in these kinds of moments. So they become indignant, Mark tells us. What a word, indignant. And they say, what a waste! Exclamation point. This perfume could have been sold for more than a year's wages, tens of thousands of dollars, and the money could have been given away to the poor. And they rebuked her harshly. This is one of these moments where the English translation doesn't quite carry the weight of what was happening, because the Greek word for rebuked here, it's the same word for snorted. That this room full of men snorted at this woman and her act. Snorted like an angry horse. Now, imagine you're not just in the room. Imagine you're the woman. This unnamed woman who's coming in, what is she thinking in this moment? Who just did this very extravagant, albeit strange, act, pouring perfume over Jesus. And can you imagine the emotional whiplash that she's feeling in this moment? I wonder if she's thinking, did I make a mistake? Did I get something wrong here? Was this inappropriate? I mean, I was trying to do something special, but maybe I just went too far. Did I offend Jesus? And so I can imagine she probably hid her face behind her hair and she just stared down at the ground, embarrassed and ashamed. She just wanted to get out of there, and she wasn't going to pick her head up to look at anyone, especially Jesus. And it's in that moment when Jesus speaks up. And he says to all of the people in the room, all of his disciples, he says, "Leave her alone," said Jesus. "Why are you bothering her? For she has done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you will always have with you, but you will not always have me." Now, that's what Jesus is thinking. But if I'm a disciple, I'm still kind of scratching my head a little bit. I mean, what I would be thinking, listening to what Jesus said, I would be like, beautiful, Jesus. Beautiful, really. Like you consider that beautiful. To me, that kind of looks like a banana stuck up on the side of a wall that someone paid an exorbitant amount of money for. But you consider this beautiful. Now, I would choose a different word. I would choose strange. Maybe a little overboard, Jesus. Maybe pointless. Not to mention impractical, right? See, I know the disciples are always on this adventure and missing the point in everything that they do, and Jesus is frequently correcting them. I get that, but in this particular scene, in this moment, I don't blame them. I mean, just think, how many times does Jesus talk about serving, loving, giving things away to the poor? And the answer is a lot. I mean, right out of the gate, when Jesus preaches his most famous sermon ever, it shows up in a couple of the Gospels. The very beginning of the sermon begins with the words, "Blessed are the poor." He tells us frequently to feed the hungry, the sick, to visit the imprisoned. And he says at the end of Matthew, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters, the least of these, you did it for me. He told one man, in fact, if you want to follow me, first go sell everything you have and do what with it? Give it to the poor. And now, here Jesus is with his disciples in the town of Bethany. And Bethany actually means house of suffering. This was not Johnson County. This was a place where people who were in need abounded. And it was, in fact, leading up to the Passover festival. And in these festivals, places would swell up with population, especially those who were in need. And so it would have been customary at this particular week to give away even more than usual to the poor. So the fact that this woman comes in and takes this jar, this alabaster jar of perfume, and pours it Gatorade style over the head of Jesus, I don't blame the disciples for saying that's tens of thousands of dollars that we could have done a whole lot of good with, Jesus. I mean, don't you kind of get that? Of course they're thinking, what a waste. So Jesus, do you not care about the poor anymore? You just change your mind all of a sudden? Are you just trying to be like confusing? Like we can't place you ever, Jesus? What's going on here? And above all, what makes Jesus consider this woman's strange act of all things? What makes him consider it beautiful? And this is the tension that Mark, as he records his gospel, this is the tension that he is leading us into, that he wants us to feel. Let me pause there for a moment. Because over the past few weeks, we've been in the series called Ordinary. And we've been looking at the ordinary people who spent time with Jesus and wound up changing the world. Now, the reason we're going through this series is because sometimes we look back at these people who hung out with Jesus and we tend to think of them as superheroes. But they didn't really bring anything to the table. They were just simple, ordinary, everyday people. People that you and I can identify with. They weren't celebrities. They didn't bring fame or wealth or influence to the table. They were ordinary. But these are the people, the ordinary people that Jesus sought. The people that he loved spending time with. The people that he invested in himself in. And the people who would go on that we would tell stories about now today. And Jesus does this. He surrounds himself with ordinary people. He invites them to follow him so that we would know that the same is true of us, that we, Heartland, all of us here in this room, you in the atrium, you watching online, that we are a bunch of ordinary people that Jesus has invited to spend time with him so that his extraordinary love and his extraordinary mission can get lived out through you and me. And of all of the people that we've looked at in this series, and if you've missed any of it, I encourage you, go back, listen to some of the messages that we've preached through, look at the people that we've looked at together. Of all of the people that we've looked at in this series, I would say that there may be no person that is more ordinary than the woman who shows up in Mark 14. And the reason I say that is because she is so ordinary that Mark doesn't even give her a name. We don't know who this woman was. We don't know where she came from. We don't know what happened to her afterward. This is an unnamed woman in Mark's gospel. Now, some of you Bible nerds are thinking about other gospels where the similar story shows up. In fact, this story shows up in all four gospels. And in a couple of the gospels, the authors tell us the name of this woman. But the gospel writers don't entirely agree on how this all happened. And so scholars are just really, let me save you a lot of research. The scholars are really kind of not clear on whether these gospels are talking about the same incident of a woman pouring perfume over Jesus or if this might have happened a couple of times. And I just want to set that aside for a second. I just want us to focus on Mark's gospel because I think it's pretty intentional of Mark for us not to tell us her name. I don't think it's because he didn't know it. I think Mark wants her to be even that more ordinary to us so that we ourselves can be able to identify with her. And so he doesn't give us her name. We're just going to focus on his gospel. In fact, Mark's goal in his entire gospel, the entire goal of Mark's gospel, two things. One, he wants to show us who Jesus is. Secondly, he wants to show us what it means to be a follower of Jesus. If you were in our men's study this past fall and we studied Mark's gospel in depth, you'll remember this. Mark is out there to show us who Jesus is and what being his follower means. And so, as Jesus is getting ready to go to the cross to save the world, Mark spotlights this ordinary, unnamed woman to show us what following Jesus is, in fact, all about. And in a word, it's this. It's devotion. Would everyone just say out loud, devotion? Devotion. There you go. That's what it's about. That's a big word. Devotion. You think about devotion. Devotion is loyalty and dedication. It's commitment. It's sacrifice. It's worship. True devotion goes beyond just surface level interest because you're actually investing yourself deeply in something. Now, you and I, we're devoted to all sorts of things in our life, good things. You're hopefully devoted to your family, to your job. You've got hobbies that you're devoted to, teams that you're devoted to. But this passage makes us ask ourselves, how devoted am I willing to be? How devoted are you willing to be to Jesus? In fact, if we really take this passage seriously, if I really preach this passage the way that I should, then by the time we get to the end of it, all of us should ask ourselves, am I really willing to be that devoted to Jesus? That's where we're going in this message, because our love of Jesus, hear this, our love of Jesus isn't simply seen or measured in the declarations that we make about Jesus. Our love of Jesus is seen and measured in the devotion that we express to him. And we have this woman, this ordinary, unnamed woman, to give us an example of the kind of devotion that Jesus deserves, that Jesus asks of us. The question is, are we willing to give it to him? So, what makes this woman's devotion so beautiful? You may not be surprised that as I spent time with this week, I came up with 3 reasons. 3 reasons why her devotion is so beautiful, and they all happen to start with the same letter. So the rest of today's message has been brought to you by the letter E. What makes her devotion so beautiful? Her devotion was extravagant. This woman brought her best, and she brought it all. This alabaster jar could have been anywhere from about yay to yay high or so, and it would have been a ceramic marble-like material. It probably was a family heirloom. This is the kind of thing that would have been passed down through generations. And the perfume inside, Mark tells us that it was made from pure nard. Now, nard is actually, we're like, nard. Nard is actually from the root of an herb that grows in the Himalayan mountains. I researched this week. Aren't you impressed? But it grows in the foothills of the Himalayan mountains. And this isn't some perfume from Walgreens. That's what I want us to see. This is from the Orient. This is quite extravagant. And there's a couple of words that stand out to me in Mark's retelling of the story. The first is that she broke the jar. You take this family heirloom, she comes in and she broke the jar. She snapped the neck of it as if she couldn't get the perfume out fast enough. And then there's this other word that she poured. She poured the perfume on Jesus' head. She poured. She didn't just carefully drizzle it or ration it out a little bit. She poured excessively. In other words, she's making a mess. Now, to be honest with you, when it comes to nice things, I'm not that much of a pourer. I'm more of a drizzler. I don't have a lot of experience with perfume. But I do have experience with another nicety, maple syrup. Most of my life, I was just eating the cheap stuff. You know, the 2 or 3 bottle of glorified corn syrup, right? And I'm pouring my pancakes and waffles with that stuff. But we spent 5 years up in Minnesota, and while we were there, I realized that there is a world of difference in the kind of maple syrup that is out there. Anyone else, have you realized this? Yeah, I know I'm slow, okay? It took me living in Minnesota for 5 years and actually tapping the maple trees and learning that to get the good stuff, it takes 40 gallons of sap boiled down to 1 gallon of pure maple syrup. And when you taste it, you will pay an arm and a leg for it because it is so good. And there is no going back, but you actually do pay an arm and a leg for it. It's about $10 for a little bottle like this, right? And so we began buying the good stuff. Now, frugal Brad, my wife is over here, frugal Brad does not like buying the good stuff. And if we're going to go ahead and buy the good stuff, we're going to be very, very cautious with it, okay? And so you can imagine the shock that was in me when I came down into the kitchen one morning and I watched my son with his off-brand Eggo waffles that had been completely doused with an entire $10 bottle of pure maple syrup. I mean, it was like cereal. The waffle in this plate, it was like almost pouring over, and the shock in my heart. And so I did what any rational drizzler, not pourer, would do. I went over and took a spoon and started trying to get the maple syrup back into the bottle because I didn't want to waste that maple syrup because I'm a drizzler. I'm not a pourer. Now, what if I approach my devotion to God the same way? Do you pour out your devotion to God, or do you drizzle it? Are you looking for that point where it's just maybe a little bit too much and then you're going to back off? Are you trying to scoop that extra devotion that maybe came out a little too fast and put it back in the bottle for another day? I mean, when you think about what you give to God, are you a pourer or are you a drizzler? And I'm not even talking about like giving money to God. Although if that's what you thought of when I said it, you brought it up, not me. Since you brought it up, let's talk about it, okay? You know, because there is nothing that reflects our devotion to God quite like our money. We know that. You've heard that before. There's nothing that reflects our devotion to God quite like our money. So maybe if you've developed this practice of giving to God, and we're a church that has always tried not to make a big deal about money because we know that many of you who are coming to God have your guards up and your pockets guarded. We understand that. But we believe that as followers of Jesus, this is part of the way we live out our devotion to Him. But some of you, maybe you give some money from time to time. Maybe you even give some to the church. Maybe you even give 10%. But in your heart, the question is, are you watching to make sure that it's just enough? Like, are you asking questions like, well, do I tithe out of the net or out of the other one? What's the other one? Gross, thank you. That's why we have people here that do money stuff, not me. You know, are you watching for just enough? Because just enough is a long way from extravagant. I'll leave money aside for a moment. The other thing that reflects our devotion, it's our time. The time that we give to God. When it comes to the time that you give toward God, do you pour out your time to Him or do you drizzle? Do you pour out your prayers, the attention that you give God each day, your worship? Is the worship that you bring God, is that a pouring out of your heart or is it a drizzling of your heart? And so maybe, I'm preaching to the choir. You're here, you're tuned in, like you're making this a priority. But what I know is that sometimes when I'm here, I'm not really here. You know, or as I was learning to kind of make worship a part of my life, maybe you're there too. You're like, I'm here. But, you know, to actually sing out loud, that feels like maybe a step too far. You know, maybe for you read along as we sing, you tap your foot, you hum from time to time, but you'd never actually sing out loud because that feels a little too uncomfortable. So you dig your hands in the pockets, even though all over the Psalms it tells us to lift our hands and worship and praise to God. And if that feels new, just here's a couple postures. One is just carry the TV. Turn off the smoke alarm. Right? Things like this. Just kind of think about a little. See, these are things that come quite naturally in the scriptures because this is what devotion to God kind of looks like. But maybe you're thinking, well, singing out loud, raising my hands, you know, actually thinking about what I'm singing. What if other people in the room see me? They may not snort at me, but what will they think about me? And whenever we bring our devotion to God, whether it's our worship, our time, our prayers, our money, and we think, what will people think? Is this too much? What we need in that moment is to hear the voice of Jesus speaking over us. You have done a beautiful thing. This woman shows us what extravagant devotion looks like. She also shows us something else, second E. Her devotion was earnest. There was a sincerity in this woman. And sometimes it's easy to get caught up in the extravagance of this woman's act that we miss the earnestness of it. Look what Jesus says in verse 8. He says, this woman, she did what she could. Now, we know that this woman had at least a little bit of means because she had this jar of very expensive perfume. This was quite a nest egg that she was sitting on. But there's a story a couple chapters earlier that Mark assumes we have in the back of our minds because we've been reading through this gospel. And it's of a woman who didn't have so many means. In Mark 12, Jesus is at the temple while people were bringing their offerings to their treasury. Now, in the temple, there would be a treasury, and people would come forward inside these vast, marble rooms, and people would come forward and they would bring their offerings. And if you were someone who had a lot of means, then you would walk forward, and your offering would kind of echo through the temple like this. And people enjoyed making that noise. And then Jesus tells us that one woman, an old widow, walked up with 2 small coins that combined made about a penny. And when she walks forward, you would hear, that's what people heard that day in the temple. And Jesus heard it too. And then Jesus heard all of the things that people were saying and were thinking maybe in that moment. Like, really? That's all you got? I mean, why bother? And in that moment, Jesus calls his disciples to him and he says, truly I tell you, in other words, like, listen up, guys. This poor widow has put more into the treasury than all of the others. They all gave out of their wealth, but she out of her poverty put in everything, all that she had to live on. And I love, between Mark 12 and Mark 14, this woman in the temple and this woman with the alabaster jar of perfume. I love Jesus' heart for the ordinary people of his day. 2 unnamed women, one pouring out tens of thousands of dollars of perfume, another pouring out 2 small coins. And it's no accident that Mark puts these 2 stories so close together, because each woman did what she could. Totally different amounts. Equal sacrifice. Think about that. Totally different amounts, but equal sacrifice. And what they had in common was the earnestness of their devotion. Jesus wants the same earnestness in our own devotion too, wants the same sincerity, the same kind of sacrifice. And I want us to hear that because maybe some of you feel like all you have to offer Jesus is a couple of small coins. A couple of small coins of your finances, a couple of small coins of your time, a couple of small coins of your prayers. And if that's true, we need to hear Jesus speaking over us. That is a beautiful thing. You see, when there's an earnest heart behind your devotion to Jesus, he calls it beautiful. So this woman with the perfume, her devotion was extravagant. It was also earnest, but there's one more thing. Actually, did I jump ahead? No. Yeah, there's one more thing. Her devotion was enlightened. She did what she knew needed to be done. It was enlightened. There's this moment when Jesus quiets down the room and calls her out and kind of pushes her to the head of the class. He says, hey, of all the people in the room, all of the quote-unquote professionals who had a seat at the table, of all of the people who had been students of Jesus for a few years now, who could have re-preached his parables and his sermons if they wanted to, Jesus rebukes them, not the woman. He says, of everyone here, the only one who truly gets it is this woman, this ordinary, unnamed woman. She's the enlightened one, Jesus says. Now, what is it that she got? What was she so enlightened about? I think there's actually a few things that she was enlightened about. One was that she understood that devotion to the poor, as important as it is, and it is, that is done as followers of Jesus because of our devotion to Jesus. And Jesus was probably looking around and saying, hey, there's a lot of people out there giving things away to the poor, serving them with good intent. But as followers of Jesus, what we do is we do that out of our devotion for Jesus. And so she had the right priorities in her mind. But here's the second thing, is that she understood who Jesus was and what he deserved. I think more so than anyone in the room, because of the way that she expresses her devotion to him. I think that's because when you've met Jesus, like we have to think this woman had met Jesus, when our lives have been changed by his forgiveness, like her life had probably been changed by his forgiveness, this is what happens. When we encounter the love of God, which is itself a reckless and an extravagant love, this is what happens. You can't help but respond with absolute and genuine devotion. It's this beautiful giving of everything that you have and everything that you are. She got that. She got who Jesus was and what he deserved, and that's what her devotion shows us. That if you've been forgiven by Jesus, to those who have been forgiven much, what do? They love much. This woman shows us that. But I think she also understood something else that Jesus kind of signals for us. I think she understood that Jesus might not be around that much longer. In fact, Jesus says something in verse 7 and 8 that sounded probably a little bit strange to the guys in the room. He says, the poor you will always have with you, and you can help them at any time you want. but you will not always have me. She poured perfume on my body to prepare me for my burial. Now, Jesus talked a lot about the fact that he was not going to be around forever, that he was going to suffer and die, and the disciples always kind of refused to hear it. But I think something connected for this woman. She saw him going to Jerusalem. She knew what lay ahead for him, and so she brings this perfume to help prepare him for burial, that he would suffer death and be buried in a tomb. And it would have been customary in that day, after someone would have died, especially a good friend or someone in your family, they'd be taken to a tomb, and before that would be sealed forever, what the family would do is they would bring their spices and their oils and their perfumes, and they would anoint the body. But Jesus knew that when people came to find his body on that Sunday morning, that the tomb would be empty. And whether this woman knew that or not, Jesus kind of connects the dots for us. Jesus connects her devotion to him with what he was about to do for us. Think about this comparison here. This woman broke her jar. Jesus broke his body. This woman poured out every ounce of her perfume for Jesus. Jesus poured out his blood, every ounce of his life for her. This woman did this for her Savior. Jesus went to the cross to save her. You see, this woman's act of devotion became a picture of what Jesus was about to do, because when we devote ourselves entirely to Jesus, we can't help but be a reflection of his devotion to us. And there is nothing, friends, that is more shocking, more scandalous, more extravagant than the love that our Savior Jesus has for you and for me. And so the question for us, the question that we have to ask ourselves, that I want you to ask yourself, is what do you want your devotion to Jesus to look like? Just think about it. What do you want your devotion to Jesus to look like? And there's sometimes when we ask ourselves these kinds of questions, there's sometimes this tendency to feel guilty. Be like, God, I am trying to muster up more devotion. I am trying to muster up more prayers or more of a desire to read your word or whatever it may be, which is why I want to preface the question, because if we want to think about what our devotion to Jesus should look like or what we want it to look like, it starts by seeing Jesus' devotion to us. And that's what produces the response in us that this woman had. She didn't have to muster up anything. She was responding to the Savior and the love that she knew. And so, as you consider, what do you want your devotion to Jesus to look like? Think about his devotion to you, and also think about this. Is there a jar of something in your life that you are holding tightly to that's getting in the way of your devotion to Jesus? Maybe what you're holding tightly to is just giving up part of your day to read the Bible and pray. It's as simple as that. And not as a way to just check something off a list or to stay on God's good side, but just as a way to spend a few moments with your God who loves you. Maybe something that you're holding tightly to is just changing your weekend routine to make this time even more of a priority, to change your Saturday nights or your Sunday mornings to be here and to really be here. Or to jump in one of our ministry teams and serve in one of our spaces, even if it means showing up early or staying a little bit later. Maybe what you're holding tightly to is your money. Maybe it's your view of money, and to let go of your view, to not see it as something that you've earned to hold tightly to, but something that you've been given in order to give a portion of it back to God. Maybe what you're holding tightly to is just your desire to do church at a comfortable, safe distance. That you're holding tightly to this desire to stay anonymous versus taking that risky step of stepping forward and experiencing the beautiful but sometimes messy blessing of community with other people. Whatever it is for you, whatever it is that we're holding tightly to, it's so easy to hold that tightly because of how awkward and how vulnerable it feels to let go of it. It's easy to think, you know what, that's too much, or maybe not at this right time, or what will people think? What will I think? Will I regret it? But Jesus calls us beautiful. That's what I love about this church. Is that when I look around in this church, I see so many ordinary people living out their beautiful devotion to Jesus, that our church, Heartland, is filled with beautiful people and their beautiful devotion to Jesus. I see it everywhere. I see it when we show up here on Sunday mornings in our worship team, when Ryan and Piper and guys like Wes and Leo are just giving it their all. And these guys are playing their guitars with everything that they've got in them, not showing off anything except the absolute joy that they have in Jesus. I see it in people like Tracy Bird and Leslie Coleman, who for decades now have been pushing the strollers in our Heartland Kids Wing, keeping our kids loved and happy and cared for so that they can experience the love of Jesus. I see it in someone like Rachel. Rachel, who stepped in a couple of years ago to lead a high school group of girls on Wednesday nights. And Rachel, what she was holding tightly to was just this discomfort with praying out loud. But then she would tell you she was willing to let that go, awkward as it was, just so that she could be an example to these high school girls of what a growing faith looks like. I see it in all of you, in the ways that you serve with Mission at Olathe, driving up to KCK to tutor students or sort out supplies to fill up the thrift store. I see your beautiful devotion in those of you who support families in Ethiopia through our partnership with A Bright Future for Kids. I see it in those of you who run marathons to raise money for clean water around the world, not because it's a good thing to do or the right thing to do, but because you love Jesus. I see the beautiful devotion of this church and those of you who gather around tables and living rooms every single week to encourage each other in your pursuit of Jesus and making him a bigger deal in your life. See, when I look around Heartland, I see a lot of broken jars and spilt perfume. But what about yours? What is the jar that maybe contains something that's worth breaking because of what Jesus broke for you? As you consider that, there's one more thing that Jesus says in this story that we can't miss. This is the cliffhanger that Mark leaves us on. See, not only does he call this woman's devotion beautiful, Jesus says something that I think is even more astounding. He says, "Truly I tell you, wherever the gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told." It's another moment where if I'm a disciple, I'm thinking, really, Jesus? Of all the things that are going to be remembered forever, everywhere, this woman whose name we don't even know, she's going to get talked about? This woman, this perfume, this strange incident that we just experienced, forever. And yet, here we are, a couple thousand years later, a long way from Israel, remembering this ordinary, unnamed woman and learning from her. Because when we give everything to God, when we give ourselves entirely in devotion to Jesus, we won't regret it. And people will talk about it forever. It may not make it into the pages of Scripture, but that devotion has ripple effects through people as they get to experience Jesus and his love. And so just think about this, Heartland. Just think about how, as the scent of one woman's perfume filled the room, imagine the powerful aroma from a few hundred, several hundred broken jars of people worshiping and serving and giving and living ourselves entirely to God. That's what we're here for. That's what it means to be a follower of Jesus. That's what the devotion that Jesus desires from us looks like. Amen? We don't have to wait until we leave this room for that to start. In fact, I invited our band up to lead us in one more song of worship. And as we do this, I just want to encourage you, as we bring our voices forward, as we bring our hearts, our hands, our spirits forward in this time of worship, and as we offer these things to Jesus, as we lift our voices to God, that we would hear his voice speaking over us. You have done a beautiful thing. So let's stand, church. Let's bring our worship to God.